Welcome. r/Nuclearrevenge. A friend set up my dad, and he was nearly beaten to death. My grandfather got revenge on everyone involved. This all went down in the late 1970s, when my dad was 17. The area he grew up in was in the UK, and was a stereotypical working class town. The part of town my family lived in was run down, full of poor families, and had its fair share of crime, but it was close-knit and everyone knew everyone. This will be important later. Now my dad wasn't the most well-behaved kid, and he had hated being at school, but aside from a speeding ticket he had never been in trouble with the police. He was, and still is, a really talented musician, and had a very active social life. For his 17th birthday one of his friends had bought him a leather jacket with a very specific logo on it. We'll call this friend Dave for future reference. According to my dad it was a rare and quite expensive motorcycle jacket. He was extremely happy that Dave had got it for him. Dave had bought himself the same jacket a while before, and it was a big surprise. My grandmother apparently joked that with the jackets on they looked like twins, and she wasn't far wrong. They had similar features, black hair, and were both well known for being kitted out in motorcycle gear. A few days after my dad's birthday, he was leaving work as a bartender in the town center at around 10 p.m. As he was getting close to where his bike was parked, a gang of 5 men approached him from behind. The last thing my dad remembers was being smacked over the head and passing out as he hit the floor. These men beat up my dad with bike chains and a crowbar, literally to within an inch of his life. Luckily 2 bouncers from a nearby pub had heard the commotion and rushed to help. The men ran off, the bouncers called the cops, and my dad was taken to hospital. It turned out that Dave had quite a substantial gambling habit and owed a large amount of money to people who you really didn't want to owe money to. They had threatened Dave and told him that they would be looking for him to teach him a lesson. So Dave decided to set up my dad to take the beating instead of himself, or at least lessen his chances of taking it. He had bought my dad the same jacket because these guys knew that was what he wore when he rode. He then arranged for a guy he knew to find out when my dad left work and call up the loan sharks to let them know where Dave was. What a scumbag. The revenge. My grandfather and grandmother were obviously distraught about this whole thing. The first thought on my grandfather's mind was if my dad would survive. When that was answered, his second was how best to get revenge. Bit of background on my grandfather. He was a lifelong boxer and a career military man. He enlisted at the back end of WW2 at 17, stayed in the forces through Korea, and then served in Malaya and Burma as a scout and sniper during the mid to late 1950s. He only reluctantly retired when my dad was little and worked as an engineer after his discharge. This guy was a certified badass even into his 50s, and although he wasn't the best husband or father at times, he could never stand by and watch his family get hurt. The first move my grandfather made was to call up every ex-service buddy, bouncer, pub landlord etc. that he knew, and even a few less than legit characters he knew from the pubs. In my town word traveled fast, and my grandfather was well liked and had a bit of a reputation, so it wasn't long before he had the names and addresses of the 5 men who had attacked my dad. Apparently these guys had been bragging about beating up a defenseless man from behind. These guys were career criminals with violent reputations, but my grandfather really didn't give a shit who or what they were. My grandfather then called up a few of the most dangerous, hardened guys he knew from the service. He explained to them what had happened, and they were all happy to help. One night, the group kicked in the doors of each thug and beat them to a pulp, all 5 of them. They knew that if they hit one, the others would hear about it and run, so they hit all 5 of them in one night. My grandfather knew that no one would call the police in the area they lived in. Talking to the cops was a big no-no in that area back then, so there was little chance of being caught. All 5 guys ended up bloodied with broken bones, shattered teeth, and the requirement to be fed from a tube by the end of the night. One of them had to be put into a medically induced coma. Of course, the police interviewed all of them in hospital when they sufficiently recovered, but none of them talked, both out of fear of my grandfather and fear they would be labeled as rats, and nothing came of it. But my grandfather wasn't done there. My grandfather used his connections in the clubs and bars to start spreading rumors about why they had been beaten up. Soon it had gotten around that these 5 guys had fucked up and had beaten up the wrong person. Not only that, but they had bragged about it and lied to whoever they worked for about it. Not only were they physically broken, but my grandfather ruined their credibility so that when they got out no one, criminal or otherwise, wanted to be associated with them. Once this was all done, my grandfather turned his attention to Dave. He had specifically left Dave for last, knowing that he would shit himself, knowing that my grandfather knew what he had done. My grandfather, however, was much more subtle in dealing with Dave, as he thought that a simple beating would be too good for him. He waited and asked around, and it turned out that Dave was not only a compulsive gambler, but also had recently turned into a heavy drug addict as well. My grandfather found out who he was buying his drugs from, when he would usually buy, and where. He had a buddy of his follow Dave when he went to buy his stuff, follow him to where he was living, and let my grandfather know. My grandfather then called in an anonymous tip that there was a huge drug deal going on at the address, and he thought he heard gunshots. He got two of his buddies to do the same. The police investigated, searched the house, and caught Dave red-handed with boatloads of drugs in his home as well as counterfeit bills and a ton of other illegal stuff. Dave was charged, denied bail, and ended up pleading guilty to all the charges laid against him. My dad could never remember his exact sentence, but it was definitely heavy, at least 15 years. To add to that, Dave owed a lot of money to a lot of people, and let's just say his time in prison was made much worse by this fact. My dad never spoke to him again, his parents disowned him, his girlfriend dumped him, he struggled to get a job with his record, and when he got out he had to move miles away as no one he knew wanted anything to do with him. My dad eventually recovered from his injuries, although you can still see various scars on his body from the beating he took. My grandfather never told anyone what he had done until my dad asked him about it when he got really ill in the early 1990s. Dave's life was ruined, and out of the 5 who attacked my dad, 3 ended up in prison later in life and 2 ended up dead due to crime. My grandfather passed away in the late 1990s, and although my dad and him had their issues, it could never be said he didn't look out for him when he needed it. Nice. Many years ago my granddad and grandma owned a pub together. They actually owned several pubs and a few restaurants throughout their life. Now this pub has some bars outside to stop cars from crashing into the side of the building. Relevant info. Now my granddad hated drug dealers, so when he saw a drug deal happening in his pub, he lost it. He grabbed the dealer and took him outside and forced his head under the bar. Granddad then reached over to grab the man's head and kept smashing it on the pavement till the guy was bloody and semi-conscious. Luckily my grandma called the police and got my granddad to stop, because my granddad would have actually killed him given the chance. That pub and those bars are still there, and he told me about those bars because of how dented they are. When my granddad was in his teens he also worked as a bouncer for a bit with his older brother, but got fired for almost killing a dealer. Right, everyone on this site is a grass, and as bad as that is, at least they're all usually law-abiding citizens / massive pussies. But your granddad's something else. He literally just set up 5 guys to be jumped, which is fine, but then he goes to the police about something. Being a grass is bad, even when you're a shut-in with no life, who genuinely thinks he's doing something back quote for the good of the community. But the only thing worse is a grass who doesn't even obey the law themselves. Your granddad's a fucking maggot, the worst of the worst. Unsubbing because I'm not down with these 3rd generation stories from 50 years ago. How fucking fake is this shit gonna get? Sub rules need to be a story that actually happened to Opus. Not these flood of posts where, when users have questions or want follow up, even though the story has been told many times, the poster just goes IDK. He's been dead for 30 years. It's just what I heard from the uncle's grandpa's best friend one time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit like. If you would like to see more, feel free to subscribe.